It is great, as I shared at the beginning of service this morning, to be back home with you and to have the chance to finish up this 6-week series that we have been enjoying together. Today is that 6th and the final of our summer series, Grace on the Big Screen, with our final movie, The Upside. It is a screen adaptation of the real-life story, and if any of you speak French, please forgive my very poor efforts in speaking these French names, but it is the story of Philippe Pozzo de Bourgogne. Biorgo, I think is how you actually say it more precisely. And he was a man, or is actually a man, he's still living. He was a man who is from France, grew up there from French aristocracy, and it is a wonderful film. In fact, it was the film is based, The Upside, it's based on another film called The Intouchables, which is the French version of it. And the French film was based on Philippe's life, and it's a true story. And so we have the Americanized version of the French film of a real-life story. So just know that we're filtering it through all of that. But he was the second son of the French Duke, and his wife, or his mother, the Duke's wife, was Marquise de Vogue. And Philippe became a diabetic paraplegic in 1993 following a paragliding accident. His paragliding chute collapsed, and he fell to the earth and broke several of his bones, including broke his back, and he is paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of his life. The French film, as I mentioned, based on Philippe's life, was released in 2011, The Intouchables, the second biggest box office hit in all of France's history. So it was a huge film. And the 2017 American adaptation of this film, so just a couple of years ago, is the theme of today's film series. And it starred two characters, Kevin Hart and Bryan Cranston, and also, as a smaller part, Nicole Kidman in the film. So what I want to do is just talk with you a little bit about the film. Has anybody here, let's see, I know some of you who are sitting here were here for the film Friday night when we watched it, but other than that, who has seen the movie? Just so I have an idea of the context. Okay, so we got just actually a fairly small handful of you that have actually seen it. If you've not, I encourage you, if you don't have the time today, to go home sometime this week, rent it. It's at the Red Box. You can get it out in front of Walgreens here in O'Fallon, or you can get it at the library. You can get it on Netflix, maybe. You have to search that, but see, I got it at the Red Box and watched it. So if today is your first time also joining us for this series, I'm sorry you missed most of the opportunities, but you may be wondering to yourselves, why movies? Why are we talking about movies? Is it just sort of a fun little thing to do? Is it sort of the latest fad thing to do? It might be, but we're doing it specifically because we believe that Jesus himself used the language of the culture. He used, as I've shared before, vineyards and sheep herds and sowers and harvest, parable stories that the people of his day would have related to. They knew what it was to grow grapes in a vineyard. They knew what it was to keep sheep. They knew what it was to have the experiences of an agrarian culture because they lived in it. They were surrounded by it. We are surrounded today by modern technology, at least when it works. And this modern form of communication, specifically movies, is in many ways today's parables. They teach us and they tell us of timeless truths of God's love, God's grace, like I just talked about with the kids, and a kingdom that has come near. It gives to us some sense of what that's all about. Movies are today's parables. So let's talk about movies. Let's talk about grace on the big screen. The Upside tells us the story of Philip, which is also played, as I mentioned, by Bryan Cranston, and Dell, which is played by Kevin Hart. Now, these were not their actual names. Philip, the American version of Philippe from France. And actually, Kevin Hart's character, Dell, his character in real life, his name is Abdel, Abdel. He's a Muslim man, but they took Abdel and just shortened it and made it Del. So here we have Philip and Del. Now in the movie, the Park Avenue billionaire Philip, played by Cranston, is paralyzed, as I said, after his hang gliding accident and the untimely death of his wife, who has suffered from cancer. And this is all part of the true story. Philippe's wife was actually still living. And in the film, I think she died very shortly after his accident. But in real life, she lived for about 3 years after he suffered his paraplegic accident. And so they were both bedridden toward the end of her life, she suffering from stage 4 cancer that eventually took her life. And he, obviously, paralyzed. He hires an ex-con named Del, played by Hart. This ex-con has spent most of his life in and out of prison, and he's just finished a long-term incarceration. And he's hired to be the caretaker, much to the dismay of his executive assistant named Yvonne Pendleton, played by Nicole Kidman. Although they came from two completely different worlds and backgrounds, Philip and Abdel, are unlikely friends. And Del helps Philip want to live, and Philip helps Del learn how to live. These are the real-life people. That is Philippe in the chair, obviously, and that is Abdel, his caretaker and friend. They were together in this relationship for nearly a decade, and that is them standing out in front of the marquee at the premiere of the French movie, The Intouchables, on the night that it was released. And as I said, it went on to be the second largest box office film in its history. It was, if you go back then and read in the scriptures, the story that we have today of the Apostle Paul, it was this whole idea about suffering that led Pastor Becky and I to this story of Paul's. It's a familiar story. If you know anything about Paul, you know that he proclaimed these words. I prayed 3 times for the Lord to remove from me this thorn. Paul prayed those 3 times that God would take the quote-unquote thorn that was given to him. The truth is, we don't know what that thorn was. In the Greek, it is scolope. And that scolope meant thorn, or it also could mean stake. So when you think about thorn, don't just think of like a little thorn from your rose bushes in the front yard. Think more like thorn, stake-like thorn that Paul had. Something that was overwhelming, something that was obvious, something that was ever present in his life. And it was something that he struggled with. I assume that all of those who knew Paul knew, though, what this thorn was. We don't know what it was. There's a lot of speculation about what it could have been, but the truth of it is we just don't know. However, again, because of the way Paul writes about it, most scholars agree that those who knew Paul knew whatever that thorn was, whether it was an outward and physical issue that you could see easily, or if it was a other health issue that was not seen, that only Paul knew, but everyone knew, or it's assumed anyway, that everyone knew what he had. It does not reveal exactly what the source of his thorn was. But this is something I found interesting. I think that because we don't know exactly, it allows us, you and me, then to connect to the suffering that Paul experienced because of his thorn in the knowledge of our own suffering. What do I mean by that? You all have something in your life that you suffer. Maybe it's a physical issue that you suffer with, and maybe it's a physical issue that is noticeable, that is easily seen, like Philip's. Maybe that physical issue is something that people see every day in your life, or maybe not. Maybe it's something that is internal. Maybe it's something that is a quiet, silent, almost killer for yourself and for your spirit. The thing is, you know it. And I like that this idea that we don't know what Paul's suffering is helps us then to relate in some way to it. The knowledge of our own suffering can be revealed in Paul's thorn because we don't know what his is, so we can just assume, for a second anyway, that his thorn was what mine is. If we know exactly what Paul's thorn is, then everybody who was afflicted, but not in exactly the same way, might doubt that Paul's experience was relevant for them. God wanted everyone, I believe, with any kind of thorn in the flesh to be able to put themselves in Paul's shoes. Of the thorn that Paul suffered, Charles Spurgeon, a historical theologian, a great preacher, said this, quote, "I generally find that each expositor has selected that particular thorn which has pierced his own bosom." Now, those words in Spurgeon's language mean basically this. In other words, the reader can relate to what Paul is saying because of their own thorn. What is your thorn? What are your thorns in life? And in his suffering, Paul then asks God to take the thorn from him, but it is not taken. Instead, in the thorn's residence in Paul's life, God's grace is discovered. John Trapp, the 17th century theologian, preacher, and author, wrote, "God respecteth not the arithmetic of our prayers, how many they are, nor the rhetoric of our prayers, nor how neat they are, nor the geometry of our prayers, how long they are, nor the music of our prayers, how melodious they are, nor the logic of our prayers, how methodical they are, but instead the divinity of our prayers, how our heart is sprung because of them. They are, in other words, they are a gift to us. Not gifts, but grace prevails in prayer, Spurgeon says. Not gifts, but grace. What I want us to hear in that is this. It's not how often Paul prayed or how much Paul prayed or even why it was exactly that Paul prayed, except that Paul prayed. That Paul trusted God enough to ask God, "God, I have this thorn in my flesh. Take it from me." That Paul trusted God enough to go to God and be vulnerable in that and ask for what it was that he wanted. God knew Paul's heart enough. That's what we are reading in Trapp's words here. Not gifts, but grace prevail in all of our prayers. It's not how fancy you pray or how long you pray or how many times you say Father in your prayer or how much you can write poetry of prayer or how you can even sing your prayers. It's none of that. It is that we trust God enough and we humble ourselves enough to go to God in prayer that grace is experienced. You see, there are two ways that grace of relief could have come to the Apostle Paul. It could have come by either removing the load of that thorn, whatever it was, or by strengthening the shoulders of Paul as he bore whatever the load was. Instead of taking away the thorn, God strengthened Paul under it, and God's strength was found by Paul, discovered by Paul through his own apparent weaknesses. And so I want us to remember that. In an interview in December of 2012, the real-life Philippe was interviewed, and he said this: "The community of disabled has a very strong attitude to convey to society. You can bring your weakness and your strength to the community as an example. Handicapped people can develop extraordinary strength. Someone," he said, "who doesn't see can listen much better. Someone who doesn't listen, or in another interpretation, someone who's not able to hear, can see much better. Someone who doesn't move, like Philippe himself, is much more concentrated on what he's doing. All of these qualities are qualities of fragility." I loved that turn of phrase by Philippe. Qualities of fragility. I like that. I like that very much. And I think that that's some, at least, of what Paul is conveying in these words today. You see, Philip and Del, or Philippe and Abdel in real life, they became friends, and they taught one another how to live because of their willingness to honestly and graciously share the qualities of their own fragility in life. Philippe's fragility was easy to see and know. He was paralyzed from the neck down, in a chair, forever dependent upon other people to care for every single need that he had in life. To feed him, to bathe him, to clothe him, to move him, to do everything for him. And he had to come to terms with allowing others to know of those fragile places in his life. He spent a long time really simply just wanting to curl up and die. In fact, he was angry at his executive assistant, who at the time had power of attorney for his situation after the accident. And he wished that she would have simply left him to die and let him die. He didn't want to live. But he exposed that fragility to Del. Now, the movie hints at this idea, but I don't know exactly what it was, but I speculate a bit that the reason that Philippe or Philip chose Del, was because he saw also a vulnerable man before him, a guy who was struck down by his own past, who was judged before anybody ever even got to know him because of his records. He was a guy that was different. There were 90 individuals that were interviewed to be caretakers for Philippe. That's the true part of the story, and it's portrayed in the movie. And Del just happens to stumble into that. He's just going around trying to get people to sign his paperwork that demonstrates that he went and attempted to get hired for a job. He had to do that 3 times every week in order to continue to qualify for his benefits, and to also show to his PO, his parole officer, that he was doing something productive to try to get employment. So he was only there to get somebody to sign his paperwork. He really didn't care about the job, and they saw that. Philip saw that in him. Nonetheless, he chose Del, a lifelong con artist and convict who was entirely dependent upon himself because no one trusted him. Found these two. One who was dependent only upon himself because nobody cared, and another who was completely dependent upon everybody else, found each other in their weaknesses, in the fragility of their vulnerability, and they experienced God's grace. God's power is made perfect in weakness, my weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. And I believe that that's what Philippe and Abdel experienced in each other's lives, that they were willing, because both of them were vulnerable and weak, and they could expose to one another what those weaknesses were, that they began to be strength for one another and encouragement for each other. And as I shared a moment ago, Del taught Philip how to live life again, and Philip taught Del how to enjoy life again. And that's what grace did for the both of them, and that's what grace can do for us. You see, I must come to the end of myself to believe that God's grace is sufficient. We really don't believe that God's grace is sufficient until we come to believe that we are insufficient in who we are. That we have to come to that place of realization that I am not enough, that I haven't got it all, that I can't do it all, that I can rely on nothing and no one except myself. I have to let all of that go. I have to realize that I am not all of that and a bag of chips. For many of us, especially in American culture, this is a huge, huge obstacle. Because we are a people who idolize the self-made man. And we want to rely upon ourselves, and we want to be the people who others would idealize as well. But we can't receive God's strength until we know our weaknesses. We can't receive the sufficiency of God's grace until we know our own inefficiency. We cannot know God's love until, as that slide a moment ago said, until we know the qualities of fragility. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8 remind us of this in Jesus' life and ministry. Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. See, he could have called down armies of angels from heaven to defend him, but he didn't. Instead, he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself. And he became obedient to the point of death, even death upon a cross. That is Jesus coming to terms with the inefficiency, the insufficiency, the incapacity of his own humanity to save the world, and instead to put himself into God's hands and say, "Not my will be done, but yours." So friends, I want to encourage you. You know what your thorns are. You know what your weaknesses are. I want to encourage you today, this week, find someone, find some place where you can be real about that, where you can speak honestly about the qualities of your difficulties, the qualities, as my word says, of your fragility, of what that fragileness is. Be honest. And then know that God will begin at that place when you are at your lowest, when you are at your least, then just as we saw Philippe and Dell. Then God will begin to rebuild your life. There's some critique of this film that says that it was very predictable, that it was one of those that pulls on the heartstrings, because everything seems to work together in the end. And in a lot of ways it does, but it's because in truth, the story of Philippe and Abdel's life is that way. It ended well. Philippe sadly lost his wife, but he went on and he found a new life, a new love, a woman that he met through Abdel when they went back to Morocco, to Abdel's home country, and he met her there. Philippe did. They got married. They have 3 kids. She had 2 children, and they adopted a third. So Philippe now has a family of 3 children, has a wife and a wonderful life. Abdel went on, and in the movie it shows that he learned how to tweak Philippe's motorized wheelchair. It only went a couple of miles an hour or so, and he tweaked it so that now it goes 10 to 15 miles an hour, and he can go flying down the roads. And he got into the business and started a business of making custom-made electric wheelchairs that are all tricked out, and anything that people want, he does that. And he's made a multi-million-dollar business from it, and he has a wonderful life. And all of that came because they found each other at one of the lowest and most vulnerable places in their life, and they were willing to let each other in and to begin to rebuild through that vulnerability the new life that God had for them. I found God's grace to be sufficient in my weakness. My hope is you will too. Let's pray.